Well, good morning. My name is Jim Cassidy, and this is Nancy Matthews.
Hello.
We are both docents with the San Diego Maritime Museum. We're really happy to be affiliated with the museum. It's a world-class museum recognized throughout the world as one of the top museums. One of the unique things about our museum is that we're not a government-sponsored museum. We're a private 501(c) organization that's supported by not only the visitors here, but also philanthropic donors in San Diego help support this. They love the museum. It brings a great deal of color and enrichment to our society. This museum allows and supports several hundred volunteers, such as us, to actually have hands-on experience, work on the ships, maintain them, sail them, act as docents. We fill many capacities. And so it's a really enriching experience for our retired lives. We get to come down here and actually really enjoy this fine resource.
As Jim said, this museum is fueled by volunteers like us. As we walk through the museum today, you'll see people repairing ships, getting ready to sail them, doing maintenance work, and just keeping the museum in tip-top shape and interacting with guests and just making sure that everyone who comes here today is going to have a really good time. We're going to enter the museum through the Berkeley ferry boat. This is an 1898 steam ferry that spent her working career in the San Francisco Bay Area. So let's go aboard and see what we have to see today. Enter through the Berkeley gift shop. This vessel serves a lot of purposes for us. She houses our administrative offices, our gift shop, our maritime research library, and exhibits. And I'd like to point out a couple of our exhibits to you right now. This is a 1542 map of what Europeans believed was the New World. So if you look at the background, that's what they were dealing with. And of course, if you look at the foreground, that's what it looks like now. And this map would have been what they believed they would find in 1542 when Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo became the first European to land in what is now San Diego. This is our model shop, and we are fortunate to have professional model builders and repair people here. This is very popular with our guests. The window is open and people will just come out and chat with them and watch what they're doing and maybe learn something from them. For most of our ships, you will see ship models. It's Harvesting the Ocean to my right. This is the history of San Diego's commercial fishing business. This is vintage hand-painted postcards from the San Diego area scenic attractions in the early 1990s. San Diego is a Navy town, and for the last 100 years, the Navy has had a significant influence on the growth of the city. The Navy is one of the top employers in the city. So in here, you're going to find at least 15 or 20 large models of important Navy ships over the last 100 years or so. There's hundreds of photographs and artifacts and other things of value in this area. Part of this exhibit is our swift boats at war in Vietnam. We are going to go see our swift boat in a couple of minutes. But here we have a whole wall of photographs taken by young men, most of them under the age of 25, when they were on swift boat duty during the Vietnam era. Let's go look at the USS Dolphin, which is a deep diving research submarine. So you're looking at the USS Dolphin, which is a one-of-a-kind Navy research submarine that set records that are maybe 40 years old and nothing else. Those records still stand. For example, this is the deepest diving submarine ever, and how deep it goes is probably classified, but it is, as a test bed, it would test things underwater and holds records like maybe fired a torpedo at the deepest depth. It received the first email underwater, but it was used for testing all kinds of things like sonar and just ordinary things, electromagnetic things, and all of the records that it has set, many of them are still standing today. One thing guests ask us when they visit the museum is, can we go aboard the submarine? And the answer is yes. So let's do that. It's not luxurious, but these are the bunks, crew living space, and I think space is an exaggeration of what we've seen here. Sonar room, radio room, and of course a periscope. Got a periscope. Submarines, by their very nature, need to be compact and very efficient use of space. This was, if we were in someone's home, this would be the great room. This was where they ate and where they cooked and where they would perhaps watch movies, the crew together. Just a story you might be interested in. There's a little tag up here and it says the Swing Dog 2000. One problem is if you're sitting at the far end here and you need to get out, everybody needs to get up and move, which means you're knocking over people's food and whatever. So Doug invented what's become, Doug Sweeney, the Swing Dog 2000 tracting condiment tray, where they could put all the ketchup and everything up there and just, do not have it be so disruptive when people were climbing over each other. So again, a lot of testing equipment and a lot of equipment that is, used for running tests. The typical crew on here would be a captain and maybe a dozen crew members, maybe a couple of dozen crew members, because there are several levels to the submarine, and about 6 scientists or researchers conducting studies on here. All right, this was a Navy vessel that would be used during the Vietnam War. And while the Navy called these boats Patrol Craft Fast, or PCF, the men who served on her just called her Swift boats. And those men are referred to as Swifties. As I mentioned earlier, San Diego is a Navy town, and the training for swift boat sailors was across the bay initially. And this boat would take a crew of 6 people, a captain and maybe 5 others. You can take a tour on weekends on the swift boats and Sundays. It's an add-on tour. Often they're narrated by veterans. And at one point, as you're going through the bay, you're going to be looking at naval interest, naval points of interest. And at one point, the captain will punch it up to the speed, top speed, for maybe 30 seconds, after warning you to hang on to your hats and your children. And you'll understand why it's called a swift boat. It's got 2 large engines on it, and it's really fast. But we were fortunate. There is a Swift Boat Sailors Association here in San Diego, and when the boat returned to the museum, this group raised a lot of funds for us. They did a lot of the maintenance work, and some of them joined the museum to be docents aboard the boat. Our volunteers come from every background that you could imagine. We have military, industry, education, medical, media, just about every background you can imagine. And the thing that brings everyone together is just an interest in maritime history and an absolute love of these. We're harvesting the ocean, our commercial fishing industry. The fishing industry in San Diego was basically built, if you will, and run by the Italians, the Portuguese, and the Japanese. And it was a major industry in San Diego for a long time, until at one point the tuna just left. Salvador was actually built by the museum, started in around 2011 or 12, and we finished it, 6 years later? But it's a beautiful work of art, and it's a major source of pride.
There were no written architectural records because they didn't build ships that way. They had carpenters and shipwrights, and if you told them what kind of ship you wanted and how much cargo it should haul, then they designed the hull to accommodate those goals. So the architectures weren't drawn out. They were built by experienced shipwrights and carpenters as they went.
The mapping comes up again. We have early maps here. There was a mythological island of California that was inhabited by superwomen. Queen Calafia was the queen.
Well, based upon the fictional story, it started in Spain, I believe in the 1400s.
14 or 15.
A very popular story. They talked about, as Nancy was saying, this mythical island occupied solely by warrior women, and the queen of that tribe was Calafia. And so as the Spanish explored and came up the coast from Mexico, they thought Baja was that mythical island. And so, it was in 1541 that they discovered Baja was a peninsula. This is the first propeller-driven ferry boat ever successfully used on San Francisco Bay. And as the steam comes in here, it goes into the first cylinder because it's very hot, and drives the pistons down. But as it goes down, that steam is cooling, so it's transferred to the next piston in a more compressed environment and drives that piston, which is also cooling. So it goes to the third piston and drives that. So it's using the same steam as it cools to efficiently drive the propellers. So that's called a triple expansion steam engine.
The Berkeley didn't carry cars or anything like that at that time. It was passengers, and you might have luggage and some other things. During the 1906 fire up in San Francisco, the Berkeley ran virtually 24 hours a day for a week, carrying firefighters and supplies over and then rescuing people from the burning shores. So she has a heroic role. This is the McKinney deck of the Berkeley ferry, and she was a late Victorian era 1898. So you're going to notice a lot of the Victorian decor, if you will. The windows are original. When we originally acquired the Berkeley to serve as our offices when the museum came into being. So this is, some of the windows were broken. It's not stained glass, it's opalescent glass, which means the color runs all the way through it. And the glass was made in a glass shop in Kokomo, Indiana, which still exists. So they were able to get replacement pieces that matched what the originals would have been, the ones that were broken. So that's where they'll work. I want to show you the before and after of the room here. Originally, this was very high design in the late Victorian era, this dark wood. So we left one row of the benches here as an example. The rest, if you look at, these were lovingly hand stripped by volunteers.
It's really funny that they covered it over with paint because these are actually teak wood.
Yeah, the teak is an exotic wood.
I mean, and you'll notice the holes in the seats. All of the steam, the excess steam from the engines were brought up through these pipes and registers. So the heat would come out here and warm the building, but also it would go underneath the seats and come out through the holes. It was designed to transport wealthy people from the railroad coming across the country to Oakland. There was no bridge, and so the Berkeley was built specifically to transport the railroad passengers across the bay to San Francisco, where they could continue on their trip in style.
From the 500 years of maritime history that we represent, we've got the massive cruise ships, we've got, you can hear the train going by, the Amtrak train, we've got the Navy base, we'll see helicopters, FA-18s flying over. It's almost like it's the center of the world. The Coast Guard, of course, is right across the bay. Welcome to Medea. This is a 1904 luxury steam yacht. Just like the Berkeley, it is, they have a steam engine below, but it also can sail. This was built by a Scottish, or for a Scottish wealthy landowner, and he used it to take his friends and his families just out for a nice day or a weekend, and they did grouse hunting off it, and it was really the epitome of luxury of that era. This was the smoking room. So you'll notice the beautiful wood paneling. The wood paneling is English quarter-sawn oak, and this is where the gentleman would retire. It was called the smoking saloon, to smoke after a nice meal on board. So welcome to the dining room. This was the epitome of elegance and luxury. boat served in both World War I and World War II under 3 different national navies and 6 different flags. So she is more than just a pretty face.
The original owner would use this, who was a Scottish lord, to go to the local islands and do grouse hunting and deer hunting and stuff, and he would bring along his friends to have parties and stuff. So in the rear cabin there's a stairway that goes down to 2 cabins down there for him, his family, and then in the forward area there's also 2 more cabins down here, so he could bring a number of guests and have a good party.
William McAllister Hall, and he was the first owner.
He built it.
Yeah.
He had it, he contracted and had
commissioned
the
it,
ship built.
and his wife.
You've been looking at post-industrial revolution technology, maritime technology for the most part at this point, but now we're going to move into pre-industrial technology of the sailing era that goes back, as we were pointing out earlier, 500 years in terms of our museum and the story we tell. So we're going to look at the 4 sailing ships as well as some of the other boats that we maintain that are historic in their own right. Okay. For instance, one of the first boats we'll step on is actually the barge. It was built in 1926 as a railroad car transport across San Francisco Bay. This is a replica of the first European to ever record the California coast, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. That's why Cabrillo is such a famous name in California. And this is a merchant galleon, about 100 feet long. It has an aft castle, which is raised above the deck, and a forecastle, and this allows greater accommodation for people, storage for equipment, and allows the whole to be filled with larger amounts of cargo and supplies. What you see in front of you is the chalupa, which is actually the shore boat that would go along with Spanish galleon like you see here, and we use that in our reenactments of Cabrillo's landing each year. When they recorded San Diego Bay for the first time for European maps, the San Salvador would have been off the point of Point Loma. Most of the bay was actually mudflats at that time, with 3 rivers that fill the bay. Okay, so they would have sent in one of the smaller ships, perhaps closer in, and to land they would send out the shore boat to trade with the native Kumeyaay Indians, to obtain fresh water, fresh fish, vegetables to resupply the ship. Cabrillo was under orders from the Viceroy of New Spain, Mendoza, not to enter into conflict with any of the people he engaged in, because the purpose of the exploration was to, in fact, find Asia and Japan, which they thought was, as in the map we saw earlier and we can look at here, just off the shore. They were trying to get to the Asian spice trade in competition with the Portuguese. And as you can see, this is what they thought the California coast was, and this is where Japan was, and China. Cabrillo actually was the person who developed a shipyard in Navidad in Guatemala at the time, built 7 ships, and the San Salvador was the largest, and he became Captain General of the expedition by the orders of Mendoza. Okay? As you walk around though, imagine the ship with 60 to 90 people on board, because you would always take, for a 2-year voyage, twice as many people as you think will come back, because mortality rates were very bad. Scurvy was a major problem, lack of vitamin C in the diets, and a lot of people just didn't make it back. Okay? Now, they didn't have formal kitchens and cooks like we do on ships today. What they had was a fourgon, such as the iron box you see here, would have 2 or 3 inches of sand in the bottom, and they would fire with, of course, a major risk on a wooden ship. So They would move this fugon around wherever space was available, and then people of different parts of the crew would come. They would get their allotment of food, and they would cook their own food. The Aloha expedition discovered that Baja was not an island, and so they jetted out around the end of Cabo and came up along the coast, but they had no idea what was up here. They had never traveled this far, and so they simply traveled along the coast, coming up in order to map and attempt to find a way to the spice islands of Asia and engage in that very rich trade. Spice at that time was worth its own weight in gold. That's how valuable it was. We take this out every week and with up to 30 passengers aboard for 4-hour sails on the weekends. Each summer we'll take it out for 6 to 8 days to the Channel Islands and visit. We've visited all 8 Channel Islands. People can purchase passage. And so the hold, which would have been filled all the way up to its brim with cargo under Cabrillo, is now filled with 36 cots and a couple bathrooms. And that's where our passengers stay. The forward hatch is our crew quarters, that's the forecastle. And the officers and gentlemen would be housed in the Alcazar, which we'll look at in a minute. And the crew then, where did the crew and the Marines live? Keep in mind that there were as many Marines as there were crew, because they were not only there to protect the ship from being boarded by enemies, but also to make sure the crew didn't mutiny. It took 15 people, 12 to 15 people to sail the ship. They would have left with about 30 crew and 30 Marines, as well as probably 6 officers. This is the only heavy piece of machinery on the boat. We have large poles over the table in the galley area that goes through these holes. 2 people on a pole, and if you're going to raise the anchor, you bring the line from forward, wrap it around here 3 or 4 times, and then you go to that big heavy wooden stanchion. And there'll be somebody there taking the slack, and other people will be going around and around the capstan, raising that 800-pound anchor. If you want to raise the yard where the sails are attached, they're 1,000 pounds. So again, everything's by wind, tides, and human sweat. Those are the only machines available, and the use of fulcrums and pulleys. This is the same as Columbus's ship, or the Nina Pinta Santa Maria. This is basically the type of ship they would have come over on. So this area here was not a corner for the crew, but this was the sail locker, chain locker, lines, all of the equipment and supplies you need for the ship. The chains for the anchors go down into here. Now you're stepping off of the ship and onto the beakhead, holds the bowsprit. Now this ship did not have forward sails like jibs. The only thing they had was a square sail that dropped below the bowsprit, and with this and the lateen sail, the triangular sail on the mizzen mast in the back, that's what you would use to turn the ship. The square ships above would provide forward propulsion, but square sails can only be turned so far. Okay. And so the angle at which you could turn with the wind to your back was fairly limited, okay? But if you needed to turn completely around, then you would use the spritsail and the lateen to turn the ship. This was also not only used for that, but it was also the head of the ship. And there would be a hole in one of these slats where you could do your business. One of the first ship's guns ever designed to be used on ships is a bombardetta. And this is actually 6 pieces of iron that are cast and then put together with rings that are heated red hot and then pounded on. And then as they cool, they hold those wedges together. This could shoot a 3-pound ball accurately, maybe 100 yards. but it was something for close quarters for the most part. If people were going to try and board the ship, then of course you would take a fancy shotgun. You would have a bag of rocks inside it. You'd load the breech with a cartridge of gunpowder, put the bag of rocks in, and then if anyone tried to board it, they would have trouble. Well, this ship probably had 8 of these, and 4 of these, the hole is pierced for 4 gun ports. Only officers and gentlemen were allowed here. They would have their own berth, in which they would also have their chest of personal items. That might be the sergeant at arms. Well, we have it equipped for that. Navigator over here. Barber and surgeon here with his equipment. The scribe for the ship who would keep the log and accounting. The king's officers who would always be here to make sure the king got his 1/5, the royal 5th. He got a 5th of everything anyone had acquired. Often the more affluent officers and gentlemen would have a servant who would sleep on the floor. The other bunks, if they were available, could be sold to soldiers of fortunes, who then would get a percentage of any captured cargo they could bring back. So they were trying to make their fortune. They would take their meals, this would be their conversation, the social area. And this is, in fact, how you steered ships until the 1700s. Ships did not have a wheel. They had a whipstaff. And this connected to the tiller, which goes out to the rudder, and your steering person would be here. There would be an officer on deck to tell him if you're not going where you want or whatever, to give commands. But basically the helmsman would watch the sails. We often think that they're sailing by compass, but in fact they sail by the wind, the direction of the wind. And they would set the sails to go a particular direction, and the helmsman would simply make sure that the sails remained full of air to propel them forward. The schooner is primarily, unlike the San Salvador we just saw, with the sails primarily fore and aft. For long sailing, you could set 2 squares at the top, but primarily it had fore and aft sails, so it was much more maneuverable, much faster. She was pierced with 10 gun ports and carried probably at least 8 swivel guns on her. So she was the most heavily armed ship. You wouldn't outrun her and you wouldn't outfight her. So they were enforcing customs, they were getting rid of piracy and bringing maritime law to the West Coast. These gentlemen here are doing a Coast Guard inspection of the rigging, which has to be done periodically. These are, some of them are employees of the museum, but most of them are volunteers like us. This is a much improved version of maritime technology that was built in 1848 as opposed to San Salvador several hundred years earlier. Okay. Again, the crew quarters are always up front in the bow because that's the bumpiest part of the ship. You have jibs now and staysails instead of a spritsail, and this gives you much more maneuverability and draw. This is a replica that was built in 1970. The original ship was built in 1848, and this is the type of gun that they would have had. We have 4 of the guns here of the original 8 that were lit on the ship, and this was built as a sail training ship, Class A sail training ship, for youth that were endangered, probably referred to public services, and they had training programs to bring them on here and teach them how to sail to help them focus and find a way. So many people have sailed on this. This ship has sailed almost 100,000 miles, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, doing sail training and adventure sails. That's why it's called the Californian. But this cabin is for the governor. He has a bunk down here. The cabin, navigational area. Obviously, we have an engine on here, a Caterpillar 140 horsepower engine, with all the navigational tools that we would need. But this originally did not have an engine. It sailed up through from San Francisco, came all the way to San Diego, went out to Hawaii, Monterey, but its life was only about a year and a half, and it was pushed aground in a storm up near San Francisco, Point Lobos. Now we're going to shift back in time to before that, the War of Independence, and talk about British maritime technology as it existed at the time that we were simply the colonies. And at that time there was a ship called the HMS Rose that was built in England, was then tasked to come to the colonies and exert maritime authority along the colonies to suppress smuggling, to collect taxes, customs, things of that nature. So the HMS Rose is the smallest frigate built by the British at that time that rated a captain on board. So this ship has 24 guns. It's pierced with 24 gun ports along its sides. It was a ship of war. Also carried additional guns up on the rails and decks. It had a total of 32 guns, in fact. Okay. And as you can see, looking up, has quite a different rigging than the San Salvador did, because you couldn't control this ship simply from the deck. You had to go up into the rigging with the rat lines, out on the ropes on the yards to let the sails loose. And mast is so tall, it actually is 3 masts. You have a lower mast, a topsail mast, a topgallant mast, and on the bigger ships you would have a royal mast. So each of those masts are actually 3 different pieces of timber that are stepped together and bound together. So much larger ship than previously. You know, the life of seamen were relatively short, especially since more than half of them were forced into becoming sailors. And so the ordinary seaman only made up maybe 25% of the crew, 25 to 35%. The rest were landsmen that were captured, forced into becoming seamen for whatever time it took. For instance, if you're at war, you stay on that ship until the war is over. It was a form of indentured servitude. Once the war was over, the ship would make land, they could go, they would be freed. In the meantime, they were never allowed to leave the ship because, of course, they'd run away. You'll notice that the rudder is relatively small compared to the size of the ship, and that's because ships were steered by the sails and the direction you set the sails. The rudder was only to tweak direction a bit. Used as a dockside attraction in Rhode Island for 10 years, and then they raised money to actually put an engine into it, and then it traveled up and down the East Coast as a Class A sail training ship for youth. And so it continued in that capacity until it was purchased by 20th Century Fox Studios, was brought to Baja, where they have a studio down in Baja, California, and was used in 2001 as the command ship in the movie Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, starring Russell Crowe. At that point, they renamed the ship HMS Surprise because that was the ship that was so famous in Patrick O'Brien's novels about maritime history. In fact, the HMS Surprise was in 7 of his 20-some novels. They finished the film. It was kept over on the other side of the bay here. The studio realized how expensive it was to maintain it. And so the museum said, well, look, in 2003, why don't you put it over here and we'll use it as an attraction. And after a very short period of time, they decided to sell it to us. In 2003, it became a attraction for the museum, which we sailed regularly for a number of years. Unfortunately, Coast Guard inspection, wooden ships are only designed to last 30 to 50 years maximum. Okay, well, this ship was built in 1970. How many years ago? 50 years. Well, the keel is beginning to hog or bend from the weight of the water pushing up on it, and so the Coast Guard says we can only use it as a dockside attraction now. Well, this is the capstan that would be used to haul cargo on board, anchors, all of that kind of stuff. You'll notice quite a few more people were required to operate this thing. San Salvador didn't have a helm. California had a small helm. Why in the world would you need two helms? Well, this is a man of war. Okay? And if you're attacking another ship and you've got the Marines in the tops firing down, who are they going to aim at? The person controlling the steering of the ship, and the captain if they can get him. So you always had 4 people in a battle on the helm. So if one goes, you still have control of the ship and you bring in another person. Okay? Being on the helm was very hazardous during a battle. This is officers' quarters. You'll notice in addition to the 24 guns, they had other guns here. Also gun ports to the rear, because the most vulnerable area of a ship in a battle is either the bow or the stern. Because if you shot through, it would go all the way through the ship and rake the ship. Again, you steer the ship by the fill of the sails and how you set the sails, and the officer of the deck would keep an eye on that. If they needed to, there'd be a binnacle here, which is a fancy word for a compass that floats around in fluid because the ship's constantly moving. Depending upon what's going on there, he would tell the helmsman, steer 2 points to starboard, port, whichever you like. Notice the tops are very large. That's so you can get a number of Marines up there with muskets during engagements and be firing down on the other ship. The main deck, most of the sailors would be here to operate the lines. If you had to operate the upper sails, you would go up the rat line to the top. So the lubbers that were impressed usually didn't make it that far. It was the ordinary seamen that would handle most of the sails up there. You'll notice these are tarred and black, and that's because these are called shrouds. What holds the sails in position, especially when the sails are down under heavy wind? Well, shrouds go from port to starboard, holding the mast in position. Also, shrouds go from the stern to the bow and bow to the stern to keep them from falling the other directions. Okay, so the black lines never move. Every other line that's kind of whitish or grayish, those are actually working lines. They all have a function. There's no line here that is here just superfluously. 5 rails that hold the lines directly here on the ship. They go direct up to the halyards and the lines there. The lines along the side here are to let the sails up and down. Okay? And if you look down below the bow, there's a lattice area, which is the beak head. And again, using the term head, there's a little ladder that goes down right here. Hang over the side, you do your business, you come back up. This is called the caboose, and this is where the meals were cooked. We had 24 guns along the gun deck. The entire crew was divided into gun crews with 6 to 8 people per gun. And that was your messmates. And you would have a table that drops down, you'd see one down here, and that's where you would eat. And 1 week at a time, each person on the gun crew would be in charge and be their cook, would collect their rations, take it to the caboose. The cook would drop it into a boiling pot. It would be in a net bag, boiled potatoes and different things. They'd boil it, bring it back, and they'd divide it up among the gun crew. Each one had a table that would drop down and right next to their gun. They slept on hammocks All the crew was in the forward area. Each hammock was about 1.5 feet apart. And you would work 4 hours on, 4 hours off on watches. Every 4 hours, they'd ring the bell, and you get up, and another group comes down. Okay, half the crew at a time. The Marines were kept between the crew and the officers' quarters, so that, again, mutiny being a potential problem, especially since you have indentured sailors aboard who are not very happy. So they drop a table down like that, 6 to 8 people around it with their food, and one person would go cook it and bring it back. Okay, so they would get their meals. Generally, when you first went out, you would have light beer to drink because it stayed sanitized because of the alcohol. Once that ran out, because it wouldn't last for very long, then you would have grog, which was a watered down rum. And then rum, again, keeps the water sanitized. Okay? So you had your gun crews, 24 guns, and then during sleeping time, when you were not on watch, you would go down below and get in your bunk and sleep for 4 hours at a time. So behind here is officers' quarters. The Marines would be in this area. So the captain's cabin for sleeping and the main cabin. In the event of a naval engagement, you'll notice there's 2 guns, and they would take these walls and put them down so that when calling commands in terms of firing the guns, the officer of the deck would have a clear sight of everyone on his side and another officer, everyone on his side, and you would be able to fire the guns. There would also be guns being fired out in the rear. Furniture and possessions of the officers would often be put in the lifeboats and set adrift, so that if they ended up winning the battle, they could go back and get their furniture. But the great cabin in a royal ship was for the captain's use, entertaining his guests or officers, and was a diplomatic position. So that as they visited different countries, the captain was the ambassador and representative of the crown. And so the cabin was their area for those activities. But if you see the movie Master and Commander, you can almost see Russell Crowe and Maturin sitting here having their musical encounters. Now you'll notice the masts here are much higher than any of the other ships. The mast on the Star of India is 125 feet high. It's actually 4 masts tied and bound together. This has a royal mast, a topgallant mast, a topsail mast, and the bottom masts are actually steel. Obviously, this ship requires a lot of maintenance, exposed to saltwater air, and things. You can see what the deck does over time. All of the varnish and everything comes out. The deck begins to rot. We have to replace the rotten part. It looks like when it's fresh. It was originally built and launched 5 days before the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. And the reason it was built is the South thought, well, because we give all the cotton to England, they'll come on our side in the Civil War. Well, England said, well, wait a minute, we don't want to get involved in a war, and we used to get our cotton from India anyway, so they built 4 wrought iron ships, like you see here, to reestablish the India trade for cotton, taking finished goods to Asia and bringing raw cotton back to England for the mills. Well, that only lasted about 5 years, and the war ended, and they went back to getting cotton from the States. They didn't use this anymore for that. Also, what was happening is the Industrial Revolution just started, and steamships were just beginning, which would go faster from point to point and haul cargo. So priority cargo started going by steamship, and only the low priority cargo would go by slower sail ships, especially after the Suez Canal was opened, and then the steamships could just zip through the Suez Canal. one. This is a much bigger ship this year, a lot of power. So you have a worm gear here that the wheel turns in order to turn the rudder down there. This is the original worm gear. Here, these iron balls are to offset the iron in the ship that would declinate the compass. And these little horns are for night traveling because you put a little lantern inside the saloon to give the captain rapid access up here in the event of an emergency. First class passengers and officers could be up here, and you could lounge on the deck. Working crew only came up here by invitation in order to accomplish a particular task. These are all original windows when the ship was built. Pantry for the guests was here, so the food would be brought from below, prepared here for the guests. If there was room, you would eat here. You would have strakes on the table to put your plate so that as the boat went back and forth, you wouldn't lose your dinner. And once your dinner's done and you want to just sit and lounge and relax, then you move the bar here and you can just sit and put your face this way. On the man of war, this was the great cabin where you could conduct business, but on a cargo ship like this was actually the sail locker. So this was all kept with lines, equipment, sail, and things like that. But when the captain brought his wife and his daughter, they partitioned half of it off and gave the captain half of the lazaret. Gotta go back up there. During the immigrant phase, they put this deck in. It's called the Orlop deck. Otherwise, we would have gone just directly down into the hole. Back there would be officers' quarters for lower ranked officers. And during the immigrant time, the single women were kept down there. All of the families were kept in the middle, and the single men were up front. You know, we bring school groups here and have living history where they sleep overnight. We break them into crews. They very quickly adapt to what the commands are for ship and everything, and at the end of that, and the next day we take them for a sail on the Californian. Kids have grown up through this program for years, and we have people coming back here all the time. I did that when I was in 8th grade. Yes, I remember that. I mean, it's an institution in San Diego education. And as you can see here, our Euterpe figurehead is being refurbished here by one of our volunteers. So this is a mock-up of what immigrant accommodations might have been like. Now this looks pretty luxurious, but consider that each bunk would take at least 2 people. A family of 4 would get one of these. Line, extra sail, extra yards, water caskets. You'll notice that this wall here is the only bulkhead. If the front of the bow was crushed from a collision, that wall would hold the water supposedly. If that was breached, the entire ship would sink. It's the only bulkhead. This has 2 ratios. One is if you go this way, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. But if you go back the other way, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. So for heavier cargo. The kids love it when we make rats too, because meat and protein is hard to come by. Well, sailors didn't think much of landsmen, and they called them boobies. So going down here into the immigrant quarters were the booby hatches. This is where the crew slept. Again, they are on 4 on and 4 off watches. This is the only piece of machinery that was on board, and this is part of the capstan windlass to bring up the anchor.